Hey guys, tonight we're getting comfortable. Lights low, tea's warm, and your brain's probably running on the last 5% of its social battery. Perfect timing, because tonight we're going to talk about something wonderfully weird. All the medieval rules and customs that somehow never died. You'd think 800 years of progress to world wars, and at least one invention of the smartphone would have shaken off most of them. But no. The Middle Ages left behind a sticky film of tradition that clings to us like old candle wax. So, get cozy, settle back, and let us float through a few customs that should have stayed with the people who thought bathing once a year was a bit much. Let's start with one that quietly rules your daily life. Surnames. Your last name. Yeah, it's medieval. Before around the 11th or 12th century, most Europeans didn't bother. You, where, whose, John, or Margaret. Or, if you lived in a small enough place, maybe John, who smells like fish. But when population exploded, towns got crowded, and suddenly there were 40 Johns in every market square. People needed labels. Cue the invention of They often came from, let's face it, whatever made you recognizable. Occupations gave us Smith, Baker, Carpenter. Your dad's name gave us Johnson and Robertson. Geography gave us people like Brooke, or the delightfully specific Atwood, which literally meant that guy who lives near the woods. So, when your barista calls out Sarah Brown, you're not just hearing your Urdu, or hearing an echo of feudal Europe's record-keeping problem. Congratulations! You've just participated in one of the most boring accidents of history. Next up, that small ritual called handshaking. Feels modern, right? Something polite, professional, adult. Nope. That's straight out of the medieval "please don't stab me" manual. Back then, when two knights or lords met, both were usually armed, defensive, and deeply paranoid. Extending your right hand showed you weren't about to whip out a dagger. It was basically the "I'm not here to murder you" sign. Over time, it became friendly. Somewhere along the way, we forgot the armed suspicion part, but kept the movement. So yes, when you greet your boss with a handshake, you're reenacting a medieval disarmament ritual. Very civil of us. And speaking of hands, here's another medieval carryover. The idea of eating politely. You know, forks, napkins, sitting up straight, that whole performance we call table manners. Medieval dining was not exactly The early Middle Ages saw nobles eating from communal trenchers. Basically flat pieces of stale bread using mostly their fingers and the occasional knife. Food was greasy, portions were meant for knights, and people just wiped their hands on whatever animal skin or servant happened to be near. Then, around the 14th century, Italian nobles started using forks. At the time, most Europeans thought this was disgustingly pretentious. The church even called forks an insult to God's fingers. But of course, rich people love being told they look too fancy. So the habit spread to France, then England. And by the 17th century, the fork had won. Now, you and I use them without thinking, delicately stabbing lettuce like it's a moral test. Once again, medieval habits forged by aristocrats, showing off, still run our dinner tables. We are, essentially, all pretentious Venetians now. Let's glide over to romance. Or, more specifically, marriage. You may think of marriage as a sacred union, a heartfelt promise, hopefully with matching rings from a respectable mall jeweler. But that entire institution, its rules, rituals, and paperwork is medieval to the core. See, before the church got involved, marriage was often a practical affair. Land, property, family alliances. But by the 12th century, the Catholic Church realized it could organize and control it. So they did what bureaucracy always does best. Made it weirdly complicated. They decided marriage was a sacrament, meaning it couldn't be undone. You needed witnesses. You had to say the right words. You had to file things properly as records could be filed, when scribes still thought ink blotches were demons. Even the white wedding dress. Totally Victorian spin on an old medieval symbol of chastity, thanks to Queen Victoria's obsession with performative purity. So every modern wedding, every ring exchange, aisle walk, and banquet is basically one long medieval group project we never graduated from. And yes, there's something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue rhyme, straight from medieval superstition. Back then, each item was supposed to ward off evil spirits, infertility, or curses from jealous neighbors, because apparently no union was safe without a little fabric-based spell work. Now, since we're already cursed, let us talk titles. Sir, Madam, Lorgie, Legivis. All began as medieval ranking tags. When knights and nobles filled Europe, hierarchy was everything. Addressing someone properly meant surviving politically. Get a title wrong, and your head could literally roll. So, people learned to bow, curtsy, and flatter like professionals. Today, our leaders might not wear crowns well. Most don't. But we still echo that hierarchical politeness. Call someone your honor. Doctor, president. It's all cut from the same feudal cloth. Just a touch less bloody. The sound of power-seeking courtesy still hums beneath it. It's funny. Real civilization moves forward, but our scripts for respect barely change. We might wear jeans now instead of tunics, but deep down, we're still peasants trying not to offend the local lord. Let's float to something more mundane. Ever wonder why we clink glasses before drinking? That's another leftover superstition. In medieval times, toasting was less about camaraderie and more about trust, or testing Italiano. Poisoning people was distressingly common. So, hosts and guests would clink goblets hard enough that wine might splash into each other's cups, symbolizing, "See, I didn't kill you." So, cheers, dear listener. Every toast at your cousin's wedding is basically a reenactment of aristocratic paranoia. Drink up, and may both your chalices stay on. Now let's step outside to architecture. You know that fairy tale style castle, aesthetic pointed arches, stained glass, battlements that serve no purpose on modern buildings. That's the ghost of Gothic architecture refusing to quit. When Gothic style first appeared around the 12th century, it was revolutionary. Pointed arches meant taller cathedrals. Flying buttresses meant drama. The whole thing was meant to symbolize heaven reaching down to earth. But humans, being humans, loved the aesthetic more than the theology. That's why even today, universities, churches, and random city halls copy that look. Big spires, absurd stonework, decorative nonsense. As our architectural cosplay of holiness, we literally built fake castles for Victorian lords who wanted to feel medieval. And modern architects still sprinkle neo-Gothic into everything from Manhattan skyscrapers to campus libraries. So if you've ever looked at a building and thought, why does this office look like Dracula's Airbnb? That's why. And speaking of castles, let's discuss our strange obsession with privacy. In the medieval world, privacy basically didn't exist. People slept communally, ate together, shared rooms, even shared beds. Nobles had small chambers, but servants and guards were everywhere. Doors had curtains, not locks. Then the Renaissance and later, the Enlightenment gave privacy. People began valuing solitude as something noble, civilized, almost moral. But the seeds of that dignity and solitude idea trace back to monastic life, where monks lived apart to avoid sin. So next time you close your bedroom door and breathe out that private sigh of relief, thanks centuries of monks trying not to gossip in the cloister. Solitude became holiness, then became mental health. Funny how that worked out. Let's linger on another rule that refuses to die: dressing formally. Suits, ties, gowns, all of them descend from court fashion. Those funny little human inventions designed to show you had money and stood above the sweaty masses. The three-piece suit, it started as a 17th century update of knightly attire. Fitted doublets, short jackets, stockings. Tailored lines meant luxury. You needed servants to dress you. Fast forward a few centuries, and now we pretend corporate uniforms are stylish instead of just medieval ego armor. Even the tie itself has weird origins. Early versions, called cravats, were silk bands tied by Croatian mercenaries in the 1600s. adopted by Parisian elites who thought it looked dashing. In reality, by modern logic, we're wearing strangulation accessories as fashion statements because some Renaissance soldier looked cute. Medieval in spirit, if not in century. Let's drift to what we eat. Bread, for instance, our daily staple. For most of the medieval peasantry, bread was everything, sometimes mixed with barley, oats, or beans, depending on famine levels. The term upper crust literally came from nobility cutting off the clean top of a since lower sections were often burned or filthy from baking pans. So when someone today says he's from the upper crust, they're unconsciously quoting 1,000 years of class division baked into actual bread. Deliciously ironic. While we're here, our fondness for sitting in family positions at the dinner table that traces two medieval households. Two, the master of the house sat at the high table, literally elevated on a small platform, with lesser guests lower down. Today we replace platforms with head chairs, but the power geometry stays. Each apace, the patriarchy's watching. Time itself still carries a medieval hangover. The hours you wake, work, pray, or rest, those were standardized by monastic bell schedules. The word noon originally meant 3 p.m. Monks just kept shifting prayers earlier until nones ended up midday, and everyone followed. Humans, being consistent creatures of chaos, never fixed it. Even the 7-day week owes its rhythm to a blend of biblical and Roman tradition, solidified by the church calendar. That's why Monday feels existentially doomed. It's literally named after the moon, whose vibes are famously unstable. So when your alarm rings at 7 a.m., congratulate yourself. You're living by Benedictine scheduling logic from the 6th century. Now, you might think Sir and Madam were weird enough, but let's talk about the other ritual inherited from sheer medieval logic. Standing in line seems modern, but humans didn't naturally form polite queues until order-obsessed societies enforced it. In market towns and during pilgrimages, medieval peasants frequently mobbed sellers, so authorities church or crown forced people into single-file submission. It worked a little too well. Now we queue for coffee, toilets, buses, everything. Every neatly spaced line is a living memorial to medieval crowd control. Feudalism trained us, and we're still obedient. And we haven't even reached one of my favorites. Universities. You'd think modern education is a beacon of progress, but higher education is structurally medieval. The University of Bologna, 1088, and Oxford, 1096. Both began as cooperatives of scholars under church oversight. The robes, the Latin, mottos, the pointless hierarchy of bachelor, master, and doctor. All medieval. Even the tradition of tossing hats at graduation is a watered-down echo of clerical rituals symbolically removing your cap to show humility before God. Which is funny, because today's students mostly remove it to take selfies and escape tuition debt. But the robes remain a 1,000-year fashion statement. Bless its resilience. The list keeps going. We still ring bells to mark time. We still hold courtrooms like feudal halls with one elevated judge. Welcome back, wanderer. Glad you didn't drift off completely during all that talk about forks and Let's keep floating through the medieval mistwear rules. We're a mix of superstition, bad hygiene, and surprisingly persistent bureaucracy. We left off at the strange traditions still haunting our daily lives. So let us start with one that might greet you every morning. Waking up at 7 a.m. Because of the workday, you might think the 9-to-5 grind is some industrial age invention tied to factory whistles and capitalism. But no, its ghostly outline comes straight from medieval monastic life. Monks ran on bells, not bosses. They divided the day into sections for prayer, labor, eating, and sleep. Lauds before sunrise, terce mid-morning, sext at noon. You can see where this is going. They created a rhythm so structured that even centuries later, when secular society took over, it felt natural. Factories just replaced the abbey. The punch clock replaced the bell. So that morning alarm assaulting your peace? Thank a 10th century monk who liked keeping things punctual for God. Now, speaking of time and control, let's visit another medieval leftover. Guilty obsession with productivity, that urge to earn your rest, to keep track of your hours. It's more than modern guilt. It's Christian moral guilt disguised as hustle culture. In monasteries, work wasn't just necessary, it was divine. Praying while weaving baskets, holy multitasking. So the church taught Europe that idleness was sin. Fast forward to today, and we have corporations instead of monasteries, managers instead of abbots, but identical guilt when we fail to make progress. Humanity just swapped rosaries for spreadsheets. The ideology didn't vanish. It just updated the branding. Let's stroll into another holdover, the way we build cities. Ever notice how European towns seem impossible for cars? Streets so narrow they feel designed for That's because they were. Medieval cities grew like spilled ink, twisting around markets, wells, and churches. Roads curved to match terrain, or even old Roman ruins underneath. There was no planning, no grid, and instead of demolishing it all later, modern cities just built around those bones. That's why London still feels like it's permanently late for its own appointment. It's a medieval way to sound like you're channeling divine Technically, the we meant me and God. Rulers claim to act with holy backing. So I was too small for all that celestial ego. Even today, some politicians and CEOs still slip into that plural mode, unconsciously reenacting royal divinity. It's hard to let go of being sacred, apparently. Language never forgives or forgets it, just goes corporate. Speaking of language, let's take a short, sleepy detour into how we write letters. The next time you end an email with "Sincerely yours" or "Yours faithfully," remember, that's from medieval feudal loyalty pledges. Servants and lower nobles wrote to superiors, saying things like "your humble and obedient servant." Because, strictly speaking, those phrases became habit, then formality, then default etiquette. Now we're attached to them like emotional wallpaper. We tell people we're faithfully theirs while secretly resenting half the thread. Honestly, it's one of the prettiest lies history ever gave us. Moving to medicine that one's fun. Ever notice how doctors still use the title doctor as if it's divine? It used to literally mean teacher. The first universities classified physicians, theologians, and law experts as doctors because they were granting knowledge hand-me-downs from God himself. They wore robes, had Latin degrees, and delivered diagnoses that were 90% guesswork and 10% incense smoke. Modern medicine might have traded bloodletting for MRI scans, but it inherited the ritualized authority structure perfectly. Hospitals, too, grew from monastic hospices, places of rest run by clergy, not physicians. So, when a nurse wheels you through solemn white corridors, that hushed reverence is medieval at heart. The entire system runs on disciplined kindness and hierarchical control. Thank the monks and nuns. They invented healing with mood lighting. Let's float over to another kind of ritual laws and oaths. In medieval courts, truth wasn't assumed, it was performed. Swearing on the Bible meant more than honest invoked divine punishment. If you lied, we still do Italiano. Courtrooms today are modern cathedrals of authority, presided over by a robed figure on a throne-like bench. Judges wear the same black layers once used by scholars and clerics to symbolize gravity and impartiality. Even the phrase "your honor" is a fossil from medieval chivalry knights who embodied virtue and fairness. Modern judges aren't galloping around with swords, but they kept the wardrobe. Somehow, no one questioned that. Now, let's glide into property rituals, which, I promise, are far weirder than they sound. Ever sign a deed with witnesses? That's a hangover from a time when literacy was so rare, names were replaced by seals or crosses. People literally stamped wax with their emblem bee, 'cause nothing said legally binding like melting bee products. And yes, when you lease, inherit, or grant anything, those words are medieval legal jargon that never died. Every home sale, every notary signature is a reenactment of feudal land pledges written under candlelight, with an audience of probably underpaid monks. Let's not forget one of humankind's favorite ceremonies: coronations. Even republics mimic them. We have inaugurations with oaths, processions, formal attire, and that odd sense of theatrical solemnity. That's all medieval church politics, reinvented for democracy. Kings were anointed with oil and crowned by clergy to show heaven approved their power. Today, we do almost the same thing, just with constitutions instead of scripture. It's political theater, yes, but historically consistent. Replace incense with national anthems, and you have the same ritual, different deity, moving along the spiritual the way we still bury the dead in neat rows, marked with stones, surrounded by quiet gardens. That's monastic design. Medieval cemeteries arranged graves facing east, toward the rising sun and resurrection. Even the idea of keeping cemeteries near churches grew from medieval theology. Proximity to holy ground meant you might skip some purgatory paperwork. Modern graveyards keep the layout, not the reasoning. Humanity, after all, clings to aesthetics long after meaning dissolves. And since we're in graveyards, let's not skip the small habit of tolling bells for death. Originally, this wasn't for mourning, it was to scare off demons who might snatch the soul. The sound symbolized a spiritual alarm clock. Another one's coming. Clear the path. Today, we just expect the chime to feel solemn. The superstition vanished, but the sound stayed. Bells outlast beliefs. They're the ultimate medieval legacy, functional, noisy, and oddly calming. Now, a gentler survival. Christmas, our modern holiday, is a beautiful Frankenstein of medieval customs, pagan leftovers, and Victorian marketing. The Yule log, the mistletoe, even the idea of feasting through winter, they all predate Christianity's December scheduling choice. In medieval Europe, Christmas was less Holy Family and more eat everything before it spoils. Singing carols, medieval street partying, nativity plays, early church fan fiction. Even gift-giving came from those medieval New Year's customs, when nobles handed trinkets to flatter their superiors. So when you hang ornaments or complain about curlers, you're reenacting centuries of half-forgotten village chaos in a tidy suburban format. Let's ease toward another cultural quirk: manners around royalty. The act of bowing, kneeling, or that didn't emerge from respect. It was practical fair management. Lowering your head made assassination harder. Kneeling, the exaggerated cousin of bowing, was a visual submission cue, a way to say, I accept my position in this food chain. Knights, courtiers, even peasants learned the choreography of reverence. Fast forward to modern workplaces, and we've replaced bows with email greetings and professional tone. But hierarchies still claim that same intimidation energy. A medieval court with better lighting. Even holidays, like April Fool's Day, trace their roots to medieval Europe. Feast days celebrated fools to temporarily invert social order, letting peasants mock nobles before power snapped back into place. Today, it's just memes and harmless pranks, but deep under it all, you're dancing on the same absurd reversal ritual. The only difference is fewer jesters and better plumbing. Everything, your calendar, your clothing, even the most trivial office etiquette, is built on centuries of medieval logic, lightly repackaged as normal life. What looks like tradition is mostly just survivorship bias in fabric form. We think of the Middle Ages as distant, superstitious, and strange, but honestly, we never left. Our schedules are monastic, our manners feudal, our architecture religious, and our institutions aristocratic. We host replaced divine order with HR department. But don't worry. No one's exempt from this inheritance. From the way we clap at ceremonies to how we file paper bureaucracy, the medieval world still tucks us in silently every night, which, I suppose, makes the entire modern world one enormous, overextended feudal system now with caffeine. Welcome, bike traveler of sleepy time. By now, our ancestors from 1200 AD would be proud you've survived 2 full parts of medieval leftovers without falling into a nightly nap. But don't close your eyes yet, because tonight, we're slipping deeper into the weird, small rules, the petty, personnel ones that snuck out of medieval castles and never stopped haunting our bathrooms, our schools, and our Instagram feeds. Let's start with that old favorite, beauty. Humanity's relationship with appearance has always been slightly absurd, but medieval beauty standards were particularly inventive. For noblewomen, pale skin wasn't just trendy, it was proof you weren't working outside. So they slathered themselves in mixes of vinegar, egg whites, and sometimes lead powder, because nothing saith glow like a touch of poison. Fast forward to now. And while we've swapped lead for Instagram filters and high SPF sunscreens, the logic hasn't changed. Looking effortless still demands unhealthy effort. You think you're just doing skincare? But really, you're keeping up with a 1,000-year-old aristocratic ghost whispering, the paler, the purer. Funny how fewer plagues, but more products never cured vanity. Let's glide into another lingering relic, that polisette clean, well-brushed expectation. Utterly medieval. Clean hair was a class marker. Peasants couldn't afford frequent washing, so nobles distinguished themselves by having perfumed, braided, impossibly tidy locks. And since hygiene wasn't exactly their strong suit, they used flower oils and powders to mask both smell and sign. Wigs later joined the show, first as a practical solution to lice and baldness, then as a display of wealth. The bigger your hair, the more taxes someone else was paying for it. Modern grooming, culture salons, barber shops, spa treatments, the gentler, soap-scented continuation of this medieval obsession. You're not vain. You're just performing centuries-old social hierarchy maintenance. The audience has changed. The play stayed the same. Now let's talk about modesty, that quiet social voice telling you what's appropriate. It's ancient. The medieval church spent centuries designing elaborate modesty sleeves, hem-lengths all, meant to hide the body's dangerous potential. By the 13th century, most European towns had rules about fabric lengths, color contrasts, even shoe designs. The richer you were, the more responsibility you supposedly had to dress humbly. Of course, nobles also had exceptions for themselves, because nothing screams humility like gold-threaded prayer robes. And yet, today's debates about skirt lengths or professional attire, still living fossils of those same moral blueprints. We dropped the Latin sermons, but kept the guilt. Another lingering medieval ghost obsession with purity. Back then, this wasn't just about behavior, it was bodily, even diet. Medieval thinkers believed food affected your spiritual and moral state. Too much red meat made you violent. Too many sweets made you lustful. Wine was fine if you were pious about it. Their medicine, guided by humoral theory, split people into 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was about balance. Eat wrong, and your soul, not just your stomach, went bad. And somehow, 800 years later, we have detox diets, clean eating, and juice cleanses all. Modern echoes of that same purity myth. We replaced phlegm with antioxidants, but the theology survived beautifully. Glide with me now into the world of superstition, the classic medieval pastime. Walking under ladders, avoiding black cats, hanging horseshoes for luck. All of that bloomed in the Middle Ages. Take the latter one. Symbolically, a ladder against a wall formed a triangle, the Holy Trinity's shape. Walking through it broke perfection, inviting bad luck. Horseshoes. Iron was believed to scare off witches and fairies, and black cats, well, they were associated with women accused of witchcraft. Centuries later, cats remained suspiciously uninvited to Halloween photo shoots. We can laugh now, but honestly, our daily superstitions, from knocking on wood to tossing coins into fountains, are medieval risk management in disguise. Chance feels less scary when you can negotiate with it. Let's float toward childhood. Ever wonder why school feels like a tiny dictatorship? Bells, uniforms, desks in rosettes. Not random. The medieval church invented formal education for its clerks and choir boys. Discipline was holy, silence divine, and disobedience sinful. When secular schools adopted this model, they took the rigidity with them. Today's students might have laptops instead of parchment, but the authority structure is identical. One master, many listeners, all sitting in devotional formation. It's not a school meets a rebranded chapel. Homework. That's just penance with grading. While we're in classrooms, let's mention cursive writing, elegant, loopy, and supposedly civilized. Cursive was designed for speed by medieval monks copying manuscripts in Latin. The script's curls helped quills move faster before ink dried. Its look just came along for the ride. Centuries later, it became the mark of proper education. You were literate when your handwriting looked halfway sacred. So, every time you labor over your signature or feel guilty for your sloppy rechanneling a centuries-old scribe, praying not to spill his ink. Now let's take a gentle walk into interior spaces to home, that humble temple of everyday life. The idea that one's home is private, sacred, or morally clean didn't exist in early medieval times, but as Christianity fused with feudal life, domestic behavior started mirroring monastic order. The wife's role as keeper of virtue, the idea of separate bedrooms, even the custom of prayer or grace before meals all absorbed fragments of monastery life and court etiquette. And what do we have now? The tidy suburban home, where people light candles, eat quietly, and wage psychological warfare over dishwasher etiquette. We can thank centuries of monks and noblewomen for the eternal moral anxiety surrounding dust and dishes. Let's step outside again to gardens. Medieval gardens were not just for beauty or food, they were sacred, symbolic. The walled garden represented paradise, a return to Eden minus the snake. Monks grew herbs for medicine and contemplation. Aristocrats copied them for leisure. That's why suburban gardening, with all its meditative pruning as therapy, feels oddly spiritual. You're reenacting a medieval meditation without realizing it. That rosemary bush, a remnant of monastery medicine cabinets. And yes, the lawn, that endless rectangle of grass, started as a status symbol of wealthy estates. Having useless green space meant you were rich enough to waste land. Every time you mow the lawn, you're performing feudal pageantry for no one in particular. Congratulations! You're a peasant with royal landscaping anxiety. All right, now on to love letters. Flowery language, exaggerated sighs, the obsession with true love. Thank the troubadours. Courtly love culture emerged in 12th century southern France when bored nobles turned infidelity into poetry. These songs were all about unattainable love, the knight serving a lady he could never touch. It was emotional theater, meant to polish manners and murder sincerity. Unsurprisingly, it worked. Modern romance, from cliches and pop songs to Valentine's Day cards, still mimics that same pattern of yearning as virtue. Suffering became sexy. Emotional dissatisfaction became art. So, yes, every sad Spotify playlist owes royalties to medieval France. Drifting further into Valentine territory itself, a medieval mashup. The Feast of St. Valentine wasn't about romance until 14th century poets like Chaucer decided it was. Birds were said to pair off in mid-February, so humans felt obligated to imitate. So now, centuries later, we mark the day by giving overpriced flowers to prove affectional exactly as the church and merchants intended. Once again, the system works flawlessly. Love didn't conquer capitalism. It signed a partnership contract in 1308 2.0. And speaking of affection kissing as a greeting, medieval church leaders absolutely hated it. But people did it anyway. The kiss of peace in church services was a smaller, sanitized version of earlier pagan and Roman greeting. Over time, it migrated from liturgy to daily life. Now people do it socially, regionally, sometimes awkwardly. A habit that began as religious symbolism turned into a global gesture of politeness. It's almost sweet, one of the very few medieval customs that survived purely because people liked it. Now, let's wade gently into gender. The medieval world made patriarchy bureaucratic. Laws, guilds, marriage contracts, everything reinforced male dominance wrapped in religious justification. Remarkably, many subtle echoes linger. The idea that men are providers, women caregivers, that emotional restraint equals strength, all were virtuous buzzwords in monasteries, courts, and theological essays from roughly the 1200s onward. Civilization just keeps remixing machismo under fancier lighting. If middle management feels priestly and emotionless, that's because it is. Same hierarchy, new spreadsheets. Let's not forget the medieval sense of punishment equals purification. From the 9th century onward, Justice revolved around penitents had to be paid for physically, not symbolically. Everything from public confessions to corporal punishment trickled into secular law. And today, harsh sentencing, public shame cycles, and online cancel culture all shadow that same instinct, purify the wrongdoer through suffering. We just traded whips for We're almost drifting to the edge of wakefulness now, but there's time for one more quiet revelation. Music, the way we think of it, was standardized in medieval notes, scales, written notation, harmony all devised to keep church choirs consistent. Our pop hits, classical scores, film soundtracks, they all owe their existence to monks creating an early version of sheet music to stop people from improvising hymns. So every hit single today is technically descended from Gregorian chant, modern rhythm, medieval roots, and somehow it all fits. Maybe our entire civilization is just one long remix of old prayers, reshaped for new anxieties. You can see the pattern by now. The Middle Ages aren't gone. They're humming quietly beneath everything: our meals, our manners, our morals, and even our WIF-fueled rituals of love and embarrassment. The rules survived because humanity loves continuity more than clarity. It's comforting to pretend we invented modernity, when really, we just changed the wallpaper on the cathedral walls. Welcome back. My time wandering in. You've made it to the quietest stretch of the night, where the light outside has faded to grayscale, and everything feels vaguely medieval anyway. Appropriate, because in this last stretch, we're going to drift through the stragglers, the weird, supernatural, hygienic, and work-related habits that trace their roots back hundreds of years. So, stretch, yawn, and settle. We're closing this gentle journey with the ghosts still whispering behind our daily normal. Let's start with something you probably did today without thinking. Say, bless you. You sneeze, and someone blesses you. It's automatic, polite, and meaningless now. But in the Middle Ages, that was battlefield-level spiritual defense. Sneezing was seen as your soul briefly leaving the body, or worse, a chance for the devil to slip in. During the plague years, people started blessing sneezers as a quick exorcism and health spell rolled into one. Pope Gregory the Great even endorsed it, because who doesn't love a papal stamp of approval on seasonal allergies? To this day, millions of people, all rational grown-ups with internet access, still perform this half medical reaction with total sincerity. Centuries later, the devil remains uninvited, but the manners stuck. Then there's the wedding ring, our little circle of forever. That's actually medieval propaganda for patriarchal property values. Rings existed earlier, yes, but wearing one on the fourth finger of the left hand, that came from the old belief that a vein of love, vena amoris, ran straight to the heart. Medieval Europe ran with that idea so enthusiastically that entire church manuals reinforced it. Marriages were basically legal contracts, yet somehow jewelry turned them romantic. We've kept that logic, even upgraded it now with diamonds, engagement announcements, and the ritual lives on. Proof that sentimentality is just economics wearing lace gloves. And let's not forget the work environment, that structured, soul-flattening concept we call the office. If you think it emerged from industry, think again. Offices are spiritual descendants of monasteries, specifically the script, where monks copied texts for hours in silent focus. There were desks in rows, supervisors called priors, and long sessions of repetitive perfectionism interrupted only by prayer breaks. Modern employers dropped the religion and kept the discipline. Even the open office plan isn't new, it's the medieval refectory repackaged. Communal labor under watchful eyes. The sound of keyboards today is just the scratching of quills in digital disguise. Workplace hierarchy, too, carries that medieval tone. Manager comes from Latin mano, agirato, handle by hand, as one would livestock. Beautiful image. Really, the idea that obedience equals stability? Straight from the feudal pyramid, the same dynamic stretched across guilds and medieval cities. Apprentices, journeymen, masters, you learned from the top and served until you were allowed to teach. Now we call it corporate ladder, but the shape of it hasn't changed in 700 years. So yes, next time someone tells you they work under someone, that's not just a figure of speech. That's feudal vocabulary still haunting us in PowerPoint format. Let's shift our gaze to hygiene. What passed for it? The medieval relationship with cleanliness was complicated. People actually bathed more often than legends claim, but they believed hot water could open pores and let disease sneak in. So, quick rinses, perfumed cloths, and public baths were common until the church declared them immoral hotbeds of temptation. When the Reformation later emphasized modesty, bathing was reframed as sinful indulgence. Cleanliness pivoted from physical to spiritual. Soap for the soul became soap for appearances. Now, centuries later, we have skincare routines marketed as self-worth. Baths replaced by product-based purification. Same emotional storyline, just better packaging and fewer plagues. And speaking of plagues, the word itself comes from quarantahirni, meaning 40 days, coined by Venetian officials around the 14th century. Ships suspected of carrying disease were forced to wait offshore for 40 days before unloading people or cargo. In short, the medieval fear of contagion created one of humanity's most enduring social tools, isolation for safety. Fast forward to today, and here we are, still negotiating its psychological and moral implications during every global health scare. 1,000 years later, and we still measure protection by days of waiting. Turns out humanity didn't outgrow caution, we just made it sanitary and bureaucratic. Drifting towards superstition again. Let's talk about mirrors. That belief that breaking one brings 7 years of bad luck. Roman in origin, but solidified by medieval folklore. They thought mirrors didn't just reflect the body, they trapped fragments of the soul. Breaking one meant injuring yourself spiritually. "'Tis middle-red, no pun intended. The medieval anxiety is about identity, your soul as fragile glass, easily chipped by sin or vanity. Today we treat mirrors like fashion accessories, but the unease lingers. It's why horror movies still use them. We might have electricity now, but deep down, we're still afraid the reflection is watching back. And what about dreams? The modern obsession with dream meanings comes right out of medieval theology. People believed dreams were either divine revelations or demonic whispers. Monks compiled dream dictionaries long before Freud made them fashionable, interpreting symbolism through God's mood rather than childhood trauma. It's honestly poetic humans eternally searching for meaning in their nighttime nonsense. The only difference is that instead of confessing dreams to priests, we now Google them at 2 a.m. Progress, I suppose. On that note of sleep, let's talk about bedtime. Even the way we sleep is medieval. Historical records show that people used to sleep in 2 segments, first sleep and second sleep, with a period of quiet wakefulness in between, used for prayer, visiting neighbors, or vague nighttime thinking. Artificial lighting later smoothed that rhythm out, but the biological trace remains. That 3 a.m. restlessness, the echo of 1,000 ancestors who assumed the night was supposed to come in halves. So, when you wake up suddenly at midnight and scroll through your phone, congratulations, you're maintaining medieval circadian rhythm with 5G support. Let's wander next to money, specifically coins. The idioms we use around money are almost entirely medieval metaphors. Paying through the nose, worth one's salt, cutting corners, all from feudal taxation. Trade shortcuts, or currency manipulation. Even tip-in began as feudal flattery, small tokens offered to servants or guards to ensure favor. It was voluntary at first, then quietly mandatory. Much like half of modern economics, even our language of luck is medieval. Touchwood traces back to touching church beams, believed to hold relics. Cross your fingers began as making a tiny invisible cross for divine luck. The divine hasn't been officially on payroll for centuries, but we keep invoking it like an unpaid intern. Food rituals, still heavily medieval. Think about saying grace before meals. It started as a genuine prayer of gratitude in monastic refectories, then became a mark of aristocratic piety, later trickled down as polite behavior. Today, it's mostly symbolic, but it persists because food still feels moral. Eating isn't just fuel, it's a minor sacrament of daily life. Even table settings mirror medieval rank indicators. Multiple spoons, folded napkins, set arrangements. That's leftover court dinner choreography smoothed into etiquette. Humanity apparently never met a fork ritual it didn't want to immortalize. Now let's dip briefly into policing. Modern law enforcement grew directly out of medieval watchman systems. Local constables were unpaid citizens tasked to keep order, or, more honestly, to enforce curfews and taxes. They prowled streets by torchlight, ringing bells to warn of trouble. Today, the torches are sirens, the badges industrial, the bureaucracy immense, but the DNA's the same. Control, surveillance, and fear dressed as peacekeeping. The medieval city-state just got a PR rebrand. Ebente Idea of breaking news has medieval origins. In royal courts, heralds proclaimed urgent decrees aloud in public squares, literally breaking into the rhythm of daily life. The phrase news meant new things told. Now we have 24-hour broadcasts shouting the same urgency at us, as if the king still needs everyone's attention. The medium updated, the drama stayed medieval. And finally, perhaps the most human survival of all, ritualized beginnings and endings. We still open ceremonies with invocations, applaud after speeches, wait for permission to leave. Every structured gathering has inherited the skeleton of medieval liturgy. Meetings, weddings, concerts, all small echo chambers of religious timing. It's comforting, isn't it? We crave ritual, even when reason's long gone. We don't know why we shake hands, why we bless sneezes, or we sigh cheers. But it feels right, so we obey. That's civilization in one line. Collective superstition that turned professional. So here we are back in the present, surrounded by invisible rules forged centuries ago. Every gesture, every courtesy, every workplace email has a medieval heartbeat. The world never cleanly broke from the Middle Ages just traded crucifixes for keyboards. All those old rituals, blessings, bows, diets, ranks, routines, they never disappeared. They just put on modern clothes to survive time's tide. Humanity didn't escape its medieval side. It domesticated it. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. The past, after all, gave us structure, community, the illusion of order, and occasional comedy. It reminds us that even when our ancestors were wildly wrong, they meant well. They were just trying to make sense of a meaningless world, same as we do. So, as the lights dim and modern walls hum quietly with ancient echoes, take comfort in this thought. It is not that we still follow medieval rules for no reason, it's that they became our reasons. They built the script we now live by softly, repeatedly, unconsciously. And that, my sleepless friend, is the most medieval thing of all. Hey, you made it. Welcome back. Lights down, volume low, brain only half functioning, which is probably the best way to experience tonight's story, because we re-drifting into one of history's strangest contradictions, a city that birthed divine masterpieces by day and enjoyed very earthly chaos by night. Renaissance Rome, the city of marble saints and scandalous sinners, of sacred art, secret lovers, and so much incense trying to mask the smell of human desire. If you've ever looked at Michelangelo's gleaming marble figures and thought these people had to be too holy for nonsense, you've clearly never heard of the Borgias, or the Medici, or the popes who treated celibacy as an optional social suggestion. So tonight, dim the light, stretch out, and let's wander through Rome's golden age of lust, politics, and hypocrisy, a place where every fresco had a backstory, and every confession probably included someone else. Let's begin around the late 15th century, when art was reborn and morality most definitely wasn't. The Renaissance was supposed to be an age of learning and beauty, but Rome, specifically, leaned more toward gossip and ambition painted on a heavenly ceiling. And at the center of it all sat the popes, the supposed shepherds of souls, just trying to keep their spiritual flocks together, while fathering multiple illegitimate children. The papacy, after all, was a family business back then. If nepotism were a sport, Renaissance Rome would have invented the trophy. Our first case study, Rodrigo Borgia, better known after 1492 as Pope Alexander VI, You'd think a pope named after the conqueror of the New World would live modestly, but Alexander's motto might as well have been, "Who needs holiness when you have good genes and better connections?" Born in Spain, Rodrigo Borgia climbed his ecclesiastical ladder not with divine revelation, but with strategic charm and well-placed bribes. Once elected pope, he rewarded himself and his extended family handsomely, because nothing says servant of God like giving your teenage son a cardinal S-hat. He had several children, most notably Cesare Lucretia, and one all born to his long-term mistress, Bainosade, yes, mistress. Plural would be accurate too, but Vinaza held the main title for most of his clerical career. Usually, popes kept their private lives quiet. Alexander, on the other hand, threw public feasts that made tavern gossip blush. Lucretia Borgia deserves her own candlelit corner in this story. She's one of those figures blurred between myth and misery. History painted her as either a charming poisoner or a naive pawn. The truth, as usual, is somewhere between tragic and impressive. She was essentially used as a diplomatic tool by her father, married off to whomever Rome needed an alliance with. Her marriages were as political as papal bulls. At one point, when her family needed to dissolve a match, the Vatican's clerical lawyers declared the marriage which is polite Latin for "we're pretending it didn't happen." But let us not forget the gossip. Whispers that the Borgias held decadent banquets where clothes were optional, including one infamous party known as the Banquet of Chestnuts. According to a chronicler, 50 courtesans performed services for dinner guests, scoring points based on modern historians doubt the full scandal, but given the family's record, no one's ruling it out entirely. Cesare Borgia, meanwhile, made sure the family brand had a warrior branch. Handsome, charismatic, utterly ruthless, he was basically a Renaissance influencer for political terror. Machiavelli later used him as inspiration for the prince, so that tells you the vibes. Cesare was originally a cardinal, but the priesthood couldn't contain him. He casually discarded the cassock and picked up a sword instead. Later, his enemies accused him and his sister, Lucretia, of being a little too affectionate, if you get what I mean. Again, probably exaggerated, or maybe not. The Renaissance was allergic to moderation. Under Pope Alexander VI, Rome returned to being a full-contact sport. Nobles schemed, artists indulged, and clergy competed for audiences like reality contestants. His papal court made the city look like a festival of silken sin. The Vatican became less a spiritual beacon and more a palace with better lighting. Alexander installed his children in positions of power, gifted them cities, titles, and sometimes enemies. Nepotism ran so deep that the word itself, nepote, comes from this exact era. It literally means nephew, the polite word for illegitimate son. You can't publicly acknowledge but will definitely promote. When Alexander finally died in 1503, probably from malaria, probably not from poison, though whispers said otherwise, Rome briefly held its breath. A new pope meant a new moral rebranding. Unfortunately, his successor didn't exactly lead by ascetic example. Enter Julius II, known as the warrior pope. Politically brilliant, artistic visionary, somehow constantly angry, he commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, though mostly out of competitive spite toward earlier popes, who had spent their funds on Julius preferred conquests to concubines, but his court was still riddled with scandal. He fathered at least one illegitimate daughter, and rumors swirled about others. Like many popes, Julius treated chastity as a flexible concept, technically respected in theory, rarely practiced in motion. His contemporaries called him the Papal Caesar. Subtle that, while religious leaders enjoyed romantic loopholes, the secular elite took competition personally. The Medici family, those elegant Florentine bankers, embodied the Renaissance dream and nightmare of refined corruption. Lorenzo, the Magnificent, may have been genuinely cultured, but his descendants, less patron of the arts, more well-dressed chaos. Take Pope Leo X, Lorenzo's son. That's right, another pope. By 1513, he brought Florentine flair straight into the Vatican. Leo threw festivals so lavish they made Alexander VI look thrifty. He once staged a mock naval battle in the papal gardens. Why not show your devotion to simplicity through floating boats with trained dolphins. Leo wasn't known for affairs, but his indulgencies, those charming documents allowing people to buy forgiveness, funded half the art of Rome and, unintentionally, the Protestant Reformation. Turns out, selling salvation at premium rates provokes bad press. And while Leo spent gold on elaborate banquets and tapestries, many cardinals continued pursuing earthly pleasure the traditional way, with forbidden affairs, often with each other's partners or courtesans who moonlighted as poets. Renaissance courtesans, by the way, were not your ordinary street workers. They were highly educated, fluent in poetry, music, and politics, companions for the elite who wanted intimacy sprinkled with intellect. Think high-end influencers with Latin skills and excellent lighting. One of the most famous, Talia d'Aragona, openly discussed philosophy while maintaining a selection of noble lovers. She managed to publish books at a time when women needed permission for everything, including breathing elegantly. In a city that pretended to worship virtue, courtesans often had more freedom than married women. Let's drift now to one of the strangest marriages in Europe. Francesco Cenci, Rome's wealthiest, not quite Renaissance royalty, but his family's scandal shook the city. Francesco was cruel, hateful, and violent to his wife and children. His daughter, Beatrice, became infamous after allegedly murdering him to escape years of abuse. Rome executed her in 1599, turning her into a tragic legend, half heroine, half cautionary tale. Artists and writers later romanticized her story into a symbol of virtue corrupted by male sin. In a city ruled by lust and power, Beatrice was the grotesquely inevitable product of both. When you hear people romanticize noble bloodlines, remember the Cenci household. It wasn't all silks and sermons. Let's float back, though, to the popes, because the papacy never disappoints in Renaissance gossip. After Leo X came Clement VII, another Medici, who inherited both the family fortune and its taste for spectacle. He may not have been the most scandalous in romance, but he presided over total chaos. His alliances and betrayals eventually led to Rome being sacked in 1527, a catastrophe of epic proportions. The sack of Rome turned the city into rubble, but not before many of its nobles and clergy fled hid their treasures under the Vatican. And by treasures, some chroniclers definitely meant lovers. Afterwards, the Holy City looked less like a beacon of civilization and more like an expensive crime scene. Still, the population rebuilt, layered the ruins with new palaces, and carried on behaving badly as if nothing happened. As the 16th century drifted on, spiritual reform movements began spreading like whispers at a scandalous banquet. Luther nailed his theses. Protestantism exploded across Europe, and the Vatican realized its nightlife had gotten a bit incriminating. Yet even amid reform, the Church couldn't entirely quit its Renaissance habits. Cardinals continued hosting poets, painters, and lovers at their villas. Confessionals stayed busy with spiritual sins and otherwise. A French ambassador once wrote home that Rome is where one comes to lose faith and perhaps gain better company. That line still feels accurate. In the quieter corners of society, love and sin intertwined in humbler ways. Widows ran discreet salons, doubling as matchmaking hubs. Artists painted their muses under thin excuses like allegories of spring. Nobles bought discreet mistresses' villas outside city walls less to hide them, more so they could approve the architecture. Rome operated on unspoken rules. Keep appearances, flatter the Pope, and never, ever get caught by the wrong chronicler. Unfortunately, Renaissance chroniclers had nothing better to do. The result? Half our understanding of the era's scandals comes from angry letters, jealous rivals, and diaries full of rumor. But the sheer volume of gossip tells you everything. It wasn't isolated. It was the culture, a ritualized hypocrisy, done with elegance. In the middle of this glittering frenzy strolled artists Michelangelo, Raphael, Botticelli, who spent equal time painting saints and dodging noble propositions. Art patronage was basically flirting with contracts. Raphael, famously charming, earned not only PayPal commissions, but PayPal mistresses' attention as well. His death at 37 allegedly followed a passionate night that left him feverish and unrepentant. Rome mourned him as a genius and whispered that he died of too much love. Classic Spin. The Renaissance celebrated human beauty endlessly but rarely respected human weakness. Everyone played their part in the theater of virtue. The church condemned lust publicly while tolerating it privately. Nobles performed morality like opera. Artists painted divine ecstasies that suspiciously resembled bedroom scenes. It was, in every sense, an era obsessed with sin's choreography. So, there you have it, the warm-up act. 2 centuries of contradictions. Rome, glistening with marble holiness by day and seductively corrupt by night. But this is just the beginning, because as we move deeper into the 16th century, the scandals don't fade. They just wear more gold thread. Popes continue to fall for poetry, nobles marry cousins for money, and courtesans become philosophers with better shoes. Let's drift next into some of the personal lives behind the Vatican curtainsmen who preached purity while negotiating desire like seasoned diplomats. Welcome Bach, dream traveler. The lamps are low, Rome's cobblestones are damp with wine, and everyone's pretending to be both holy and fashionable. We've set the scene with Alexander VI and his children of chaos. Now, let's stroll deeper into the Vatican corridors, places that look spiritual on the surface but sound suspiciously like dinner parties when the doors close. This isn't just about sin, it's about image. The Renaissance in Rome was as much a branding exercise as it was a moral crisis. Everyone wanted to be beautiful, brilliant, and blessed preferably all at once. And no one embodied that contradiction better than the next few occupants of St. Peter's chair. Let's rewind slightly to Pope Sixtus IV, reigning before Alexander Borgia, made the papacy look like a high-budget soap opera. Sixtus built the Sistine Chapel, but what most guidebooks won't say is that his contractors had to budget around his numerous nephews. He invented the word nepotism before it was even catchy. Sixtus gave titles, lands, and churches to his family on a scale that would make modern CEOs blush. Among those nephews was Pietro, a cardinal barely 25 who transformed his palace into a non-stop after-hours feast. Rome practically mistook his villa for an amusement park. Banquets lasted 3 days, perfumed fountains ran with rose-scented water, and guests received golden-crusted tableware as souvenirs. Pietro threw one dinner where each course represented a saint and somehow managed to make that indecent. Of course, Pietro died young, possibly from excess rather than divine judgment, though the two are hard to tell apart in Renaissance Rome. His uncle, the Pope, preached moderation at his funeral. I imagine even marble statues rolled their eyes. Sixtus himself wasn't entirely scandal immune. Rumors, always floating like incense, suggested certain fond relationships with handsome young courtiers. These whispers probably exaggerated to mock his vanity, but they fit a pattern. The Renaissance blurred love, power, and art so completely that affection often looked suspiciously like ambition. It's the eternal Roman pattern: deny nothing, confess little, and build something architectural to distract people. Then came Alexander VI and his beautiful disaster family, which we've already visited. But stepping past that chaotic household we meet Pope Paul III born, Alessandro Farnese. Manu's career proves one timeless truth. If your sister becomes a pope's mistress, send your resume immediately. You see, Alessandro Farnese's sister Giulia served as the mistress of none other than Alexander VI. Her beauty was legendary, so much so that artists reportedly used her as their model for the Virgin Mary. Nothing says Renaissance irony like turning your secret lover into Our Lady of Perpetual Complications. Anyway, her brother Alessandro rose quickly in the church's ranks, proving that networking remains humanity's oldest profession. By 1534, he became Pope Paul III, and if anyone had the self-awareness to laugh about destiny, it was him. He balanced piety with politics brilliantly, even founding the Council of Trent to reform corruption. And yet, reformist pope though he was, Paul couldn't resist promoting his illegitimate children. He created his grandsons cardinals, while still teenagers. Some cardinals protested quietly. Of course, the family dinner table could ruin careers. Paul III at least tried to look moral. He ordered Michelangelo to paint the last Jejunipa project intended to save the Vatican's soul through art. Unfortunately, Michelangelo's idea of salvation involved dozens of muscular naked figures swirling around Jesus like celestial gymnasts. It was magnificent, but in the candlelight, it must have looked like a very elegant scandal. The church's critics called it indecent. Some even claimed the paint itself oozed temptation, but Paul III refused to censor it. Maybe he saw in that chaos a mirror of his own balance between faith and vanity. Rome looked on, blushing slightly. Now, while popes were doing spiritual gymnastics, everyday Rome wasn't exactly starved for drama. Artists, humanists, courtiers, they all blurred the line between genius and bad behavior. Take Benvenuto Cellini, the goldsmith and sculptor, famous for his temper and his bed-hopping adventures. He spent as much time fleeing murder charges as he did engraving medals. Cellini bragged about seductions, fought with rivals, and justified it all by claiming divine artistic temperament. If Instagram had existed, he'd have called it content. Meanwhile, Lucretia Borgoa, tragic princess, outlived the family's worst years. She eventually married Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, and turned into something unexpected. A respected patron of the arts, she hosted poets, funded charities, and ran her household with calm efficiency. Still, no amount of good behavior could kill the old rumors. In Rome, reputations never die. They just become decorative. Travelers described her as angelic and dangerous, which, to be fair, sums up half the Renaissance. One monk even wrote a sermon warning men to guard their souls against that fair and golden devil. He probably meant it as an insult. History took it as a compliment. The deeper you wander into Renaissance Rome, the more the papacy looks like a mirror of the city's mood swings. A touch of holiness, a dash of envy, several gallons of human desire. Each pope tried to outdo the last one in grandeur, as if salvation came with room service. Julius II brought his armor to war. Leo X bought half the art world. Paul III flirted with redemption. The church might have been preaching humility, but its wardrobe clearly disagreed. Let's drift through the smaller scandals, now the soft, almost comedic ones. Renaissance etiquette books warned against familiar contact between confessor and penitent, which really tells you what was happening. Confessionals without screens meant intimate deceit. Romantic liaisons began with whispered scenes. Some relationships turned into open secrets. Priests with housekeepers who mysteriously bore their features. At the same time, Rome's courtesans reached celebrity status. A few wrote memoirs. Veronica Franco in Venice, though slightly outside our Roman borders, recorded her affairs in tender, ironic poet. "It is not sin to serve beauty with honesty," she wrote, and if that isn't the Renaissance summed up, nothing is. These women shaped fashion, language, even policy. They exchanged letters with kings and philosophers, reminding history that not all influence comes in holy robes. Even among scholars, things weren't pure. Humanists, writing about virtue, often lived in contradiction. Poggio Bracciolini, for example, unearthed ancient manuscripts praising modesty while composing letters full of unprintable gossip. Erasmus, the reformer, spent years sneering at Rome's decadence, but confessed to enjoying its conversation too much to leave. In other words, half of Renaissance morality was performative frustration. Let's float to art again, because gossip lived there too. Raphael, as we said, charmed everyone. His mistress, known as La Fornerina, was a baker's daughter who captivated him so completely that her portrait still glows like candlelight. After his sudden death, she supposedly entered a convent, probably the 16th century equivalent of disappearing from social media. Michelangelo, by contrast, sublimated his desires into marble and prayer. His letters suggest deep emotional attachment to young men he painted or sculpted. For him, beauty was divine obsession disguised as devotion. The result, some of the world's most spiritual art created through very human longing. And maybe that sums up Renaissance Rome perfectly. Holiness powered by hunger. The Vatican ran on contradiction. The holiest institution in the world outspent kingdoms on parties. The city that birthed reform also birthed temptation. But no one there saw hypocrisy. They saw harmony, heaven, and pleasure in conversation rather than conflict. The spiritual and the sensual just shared the same wineglass. Let's step sideways for a moment to the political bedroom farce that was papal diplomacy. Every noble family in Italy wanted their nephew or cousin inside Vatican walls. Cardinal making was a competitive industry. Florentines accused Romans of corruption. Romans accused Florentines of envy. Everyone was right. To secure alliances, popes arranged marriages for their mistresses' children. Yes, even the ones born outside wedlock. Lucretia married twice to strengthen papal ties. Cesare traded battles for titles. Cardinal nephews ran provinces the way frat boys run group projects. And yet, the system flourished artistically, financially, and scandalously. The church became a superstate and a theater at the same time. By mid-century, whispers of reform grew louder. The Council of Trent began in 1545, intending to curb moral decay. Imagine a long meeting where bishops debate how to stop sinning without ruining their weekend plans. They banned obvious luxuries, cracked down on clerical marriage, and declared that art should edify, not. Michelangelo's Last Judgment soon had added draperies. Nudes were no longer sacred, they were simply awkward. The nuptial marked the beginning of a counter-renaissance, a return to discipline. But Rome never truly repented. It just changed the subject. Behind closed doors, things continued. Pope Paul IV, a grim moralist, locked himself away and tried to clean the city's reputation. In doing so, he accidentally proved how deep the rot went. He banned courtesans, censored books, and even made artists repaint suggestive frescoes. His rule ended with riots. His statue beheaded by mobs who'd had enough virtue for one lifetime. Reform never survives Rome's appetite. The city always wins in the end. Between papal vanity and artistic ecstasy, the Renaissance built its mythology. Rome's reputation as the heart of culture owes as much to gossip as to genius. If everyone had behaved, the art would have lacked its tension. The Sistine ceiling myth of benign but never transcendent. So as we leave this layer of glimmering hypocrisy, remember, every saintly marble statue once stood in a city echoing with laughter, secrets, and very human sighs. Rome's holiness wasn't pure. It was layered, perfumed, and occasionally tipsy. The next part of our quiet wander will take us deeper into the aftermath. How those scandals shaped the very myths of beauty and morality we still carry today. Let's float toward the quieter late Renaissance, where penance went fashionable and even sin got a branding refresh. Welcome back, late night listener. We've crossed the loudest centuries, the era of popes behaving like of sculptors who couldn't separate longing from holiness, and of courtiers who wore their guilt in gold leaf. But as all feasts must fade, so too did the Renaissance's restless sparkle. The 1500s gave way to a strange, slower moral hangover. Rome remained dazzling, but the light changed. The city was older, cleverer, and a little ashamed. 1,000 frescoed angels couldn't erase the gossip engraved into its marble. Yet instead of repenting, Rome did something very Roman. It turned its scandals into style. By the late 16th century, the Vatican was trying to launder its reputation. The Council of Trent had ended, the Counter-Reformation was in full swing, and purity was suddenly fashionable again. Artists swapped temptation for tragedy. Saints replaced sirens, and everyone learned how to sin discreetly. Rome's courtesans still existed, but now they reaped fewer parties, more poetry. They dressed modestly in public, practiced philosophy, and kept their villas full of carefully virtuous decor. The word for this attitude was decoro, propriety, appearance, restraint. It was hypocrisy with better lighting. The new popes, predictably, tried to market this spiritual makeover. Gregory XIII, who gave us the reformed calendar, also tried to reform human behavior. He organized missions, founded seminaries, and built schools. But moral reform is difficult when half your cardinals still have families unofficially. The Church's enthusiasm for appearances birthed some of its prettiest lies. Saints' biographies were scrubbed until they sounded impossibly pure. Virgin martyrs got fan club levels of attention. Roman society turned chastity into everyone sinned, yes, But now they did it responsibly, with follow-up appointments. Still, the ghosts of the old Renaissance lingered in private salons. Under whispered candlelight, nobles recited love poetry disguised as theology. They called desire divine affection, a term that fooled no one but kept conversations polite. One Roman scholar said purity and passion were merely two faces of the same angel. He meant it philosophically, but the city took it literally. People built shrines and boudoirs in the same architectural Moodhoff paradise, half-bedroom. Around this time, the Farnese family, descendants of Pope Paul III, remained aristocratic celebrities. They sponsored operas, kept painters busy, and occasionally ruined marriages for recreation. Their palaces embodied the Counter-Reformation aesthetic, ceiling paintings of virtue triumphing over vice, surrounded by guests doing the opposite after dinner. The Farnese heirs inherited both wealth and vanity. Touring poets described their banquets as modern miracles. Someone even compared a Farnese bowl to the Last Supper, flattering if you ignore the context. Rome had regained composure, but its appetite for power survived unchanged. The Vatican's moral revival mostly meant better propaganda. The Inquisition tightened intellectual control. Artists had to make holiness glamorous. Baroque art, the style that rose from this era, was basically the Renaissance on caffeine, more emotion, less modesty. Angels wept in impossible lighting. Saints looked suspiciously ecstatic. Caravaggio, the troublemaker genius of his time, turned this new spirituality into violent beauty. His paintings dripped with realism. His models were street people, and he picked fights with nearly everyone, including the law. He killed a man during a tennis match, fled Rome, and still got commissions from cardinals who pretended not to notice. Caravaggio was the Renaissance's last honest sinner, too good to censor, too dangerous to forgive. The city adored contradictions. Like him, Rome always did. Sin had become its favorite subject. So long as someone painted it beautifully, love still operated as currency, and scandals still whispered behind frescoed walls. The difference now was tone. Quieter, slower, deliberately melancholy. Even architecture mirrored this repentance act. Churches loomed dramatically, their domes opening like moral sighs. The faithful knelt in awe beneath decorations that looked like theater sets. Built for God, it was penance, redesigned as visual seduction. If the early Renaissance had been a wild romance, the late one was a strained marriage, still passionate, but heavy with regret. Rome wanted redemption, but refused to live without its glitter. And nowhere was this clearer than in its approach to gender. Previously, courtesans had ruled conversation. Now, they were ghosts. The city shut them away into silence, though not completely. Elite women adopted some of their independence but carefully redefined it as virtue by intellect. Writers like Vittoria Colonna navigated this tightrope skillfully. She befriended Michelangelo, wrote delicate, spiritual poetry, and embodied sanctified femininity for the new Rome. Yet her letters glimmer with longing disguised as theology, medieval guilt, dressed in Renaissance grammar. Meanwhile, men were supposed to balance restraint and pageantry. The ideal courtier, according to Castiglione, was disciplined but charming, modest in speech, extravagant in everything else. His book, The Courtier, became a moral manual disguised as polite conversation. Everyone in Rome read it. No one followed it. You can almost picture the cardinals nodding solemnly while planning their next villa party. Let's not forget the Jesuit spiritual shock troops of this moral turnaround. Founded by Ignatius Loyola, their mission was discipline, education, and obedience. They poured into schools and courts, correcting manners with holy precision. The irony, they became masters of persuasion, rhetoric, and image controlled the same arts their predecessors had abused. If the Borgias defined sin, the Jesuits redefined spin. Back in the public squares, morality plays grew popular. Literally, people staged them outdoors. Actors portrayed saints triumphing over lust, while the audience gently flirted between acts. Rome wasn't trying to erase sin. It was domesticating it, making it orderly, presentable, useful for teaching children. The city learned to moralize without growing dull. That's the true Renaissance trick. to look righteous while staying interesting. By the 1600s, Rome had entered the Baroque stage properly. Papal power had stabilized. Europe's wars had exhausted idealism. Sensuality transformed from shock to metaphor. Religious art now embraced human emotion as proof of divine truth. If earlier popes sinned accidentally, their successors turned passion into propaganda. Painters showed saints dying of holy love, their bodies twisting like dancers. Sculptors carved ecstasy onto angelic faces. Bernini's The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa practically glows with double meaning. Audiences gasped, critics debated, and everyone agreed it was definitely about spirituality. Probably, even when repenting, Rome couldn't stop flirting. In the villas surrounding the city, noble families kept archives that historians would later mistake for administrative records, but were mostly love letters and theatrical receipts. These people commissioned painters to immortalize their favorite scandals under biblical disguises. Judith slain Holofernes looked suspiciously like a social rival. Portraits turned personal power into religious allegory. Chastity was painted as cascading white fabric, repentance as expensive gold. To the Roman elite, morality was an aesthetic project, not a lifestyle choice. Let's wander briefly through the quieter rhythms, the daily piety of ordinary Romans. Markets still bustled under church bells. Gossip still replaced theology as entertainment. But even shopkeepers performed virtue carefully. Crosses over doors, relics on shelves, whispered prayers before dinner, all gestures borrowed from centuries of church marketing. Rome may have invented indulgence, but counter-reformation, Rome mastered performance. Sanctity became public relations. By now, even confession had turned artistic. Jesuit confessors composed eloquent questions about purity. Penitents responded poetically. Church manuals published sampled dialogues so people wouldn't embarrass themselves confessing incorrectly. You could buy illustrated guides to the 7 deadly sins, each drawn lovingly. Of course, one almost suspects Rome never wanted people to stop sin only, to sin neatly, gently, with paperwork. And yet, despite all the polish, whispers of nostalgia filled the air. People missed the unruly creativity of earlier decades. The chaos that had made autumn love so dangerously brilliant. Writers like Giordano Bruno tried to recapture that cosmic daring. He blended philosophy with mysticism, hinting that human desire mirrored divine creation. Rome thanked him by burning him alive in 1600. The Renaissance, it seemed, had outlived its tolerance for spiritual improvisation. That execution marked something symbolic. The curtain fall of Rome's artistic freedom. The same city that once celebrated sinful genius now feared imagination. The church's scandals had reshaped it into an anxious guardian of appearances. But even repression carried beauty. Bernini's churches, Caravaggio's shadows, and the whispered letters between noble lovers Olivet radiated that uniquely. Roman contradiction. Desire, repackaged as devotion. So, as the glitter settled, and the holy silence deepened Renaissance, Rome did what it always did best, turned its own shame into spectacle. The sinners of yesterday became cautionary saints. The courtesans turned allegorical. The popes became distant silhouettes under domes that still smelled faintly of incense and arrogance. Rome learned to live with itself, to sin in moderation, paint it beautifully, and repent when convenient. In other words, it matured. As the night stretches thin, the echo of that city still hums around us. Every time you pass a cathedral or see marble figures staring wistfully into eternity, remember, they were carved by hands that knew both lust and faith. The Renaissance didn't end. It just changed tone from drumbeat to heartbeat. And in those quiet heartbeats, the scandals of Rome turned into history's lullaby. Welcome, bike, gentle traveler. You've stayed through popes with too many children, cardinals who confused sainthood with nightlife, and artists who turned guilt into marble. Now, as the candle burns low, and Rome settles into its centuries-long hangover, we drift toward the quieter end of our story, the long afterglow of sin, art, and beauty that never really went away. By the time the Renaissance faded into the Baroque age, Rome looked like a moral prodigy on paper and a recidivist in spirit. The church's architecture towered higher, its art shone brighter, and its sermons preached chastity so loudly you could almost hear the irony across the Piazza Navona. But the scandals had done their work. They had changed the DNA of Europe. Suddenly, beauty was no longer just divine. It was dangerous. Desire no longer hid in alleyways, painted itself into heaven's ceiling. The tension between lust and holiness became the artistic heartbeat of the next 3 centuries. Every empire that came after borrowed Rome's blueprint, the facade of piety, the whisper of power, the quiet appetite underneath. The men who had once ruled Renaissance Rome became myths, reshaped by time into moral fables. Alexander VI turned into a caricature of corruption, Cesare Borgia into a Machiavellian archetype. Poor Lucretia lingered halfway between villainous and victo, romanticized by every dramatist who needed a dangerous woman with good lighting. But the truth always, smoother than legendese, that these figures were less monstrous than human. They lived in an age that didn't yet know how to separate holiness from politics, morality from spectacle. They built empires with the same hands they clasped in prayer. Their sins were not unique. They were amplified by marble and memory. And art remembered. Caravaggio's chiaroscuro do Chave, split between light and shadow, became the visual metaphor for the entire Renaissance conscience. Light for faith, shadow for desire. Every canvas painted afterward carried a whisper of that inner struggle. Humanity never really stopped painting itself as both sinner and saint. Even the later Romantics, centuries away, kept Rome tucked behind their metaphors. The city's contradictions became a lens for human nature itself. How even our holiest dreams cast seductive as the centuries blurred forward. The scandals transformed again, no longer whispered confessions, but parables. The Vatican cleaned house externally, but inside its relics and records. The memory of Renaissance Rome remained like perfume on ancient silk. It reminded each new generation that humans can build cathedrals and still trip over temptation on the way out. In a way, those scandals democratized sin. They proved that even popes, princes, and painters could fail. Spectacularly, which was strangely comforting to the masses. If holiness was impossible for the Vatican, the average baker felt no guilt enjoying a little bread more than prayer. The intellectual world, too, inherited the paradox. When Enlightenment thinkers later challenged religion, they weren't entirely rejecting faith. They were reacting to the Renaissance hangover. They wanted morality without the theatrics, science without confessionals, truth without silk-dripped hypocrisy. Ironically, their rebellion kept the same rhythm. Passion for purity, obsession with reason. It was the same dance Rome had been doing since the 1400s, just in different costumes. Let's slow our pacing a little back to art again, where the Renaissance never really died. You can see its echo in every romantic painting of the 18th century, in every melancholic opera written about fallen women and noble sinners. Even the modern fascination with scandal and celebrity culture is a faint echo of papal Rome, the same gawking curiosity disguised as moral outrage. We still consume sin as entertainment, just like Renaissance cardinals reading salacious chronicles in the guise of theology. Humanity hasn't changed. Only the audience seats have better cushions. Now, for Rome itself, time became the best cleaner. The city aged gracefully, letting its grime turn to patina. People forgot the gossip, but kept the beauty. Tourists would eventually stare up at the Sistine ceiling, sighing about anatomy and genius, rarely thinking of the corruption that paid for every stroke of that brush. It's poetic, really. The world moved on, and Rome's scenes fossilized into heritage. That, perhaps, is the Renaissance's greatest trick. It transformed its own decadence into history's bedtime story. We romanticize it now. The velvet cloaks, the candlelit salons, the mysterious smiles. We forget that those smiles were forged amid debt, hypocrisy, and manipulation, because the art that survived was simply too lovely to feel guilty about. Even the church learned to curate its past rather than cleanse it. Museums replaced confessionals, preservation replaced penance. Where earlier popes saw scandal, later popes saw tourism. And yet, The Renaissance temperament lingers in us more than we admit. Every modern tension between appearance and reality, desire and decorum, owes something to that age. The world before it felt medieval structured, obedient, certain. The world after it felt terribly aware, self-conscious, human. The Borgias and Medici may have fallen, but their legacies of fusion of lust and intellect, sin and art became our cultural operating system. We still chase beauty, knowing it corrupts, still build idols while lecturing ourselves about humility. Even in modern Rome, walking past those gilded churches, one still feels the hum. The same stone corridors where papal mysticism once whispered now echo tourists' footsteps. The frescoes still glow, unapologetic. The marble cherubs, forever mid-sigh, might just be smirking at us at our pride in being more enlightened. Our faith that progress finally tamed desire. It hasn't. We've only learned to frame it better. Let's linger on that, because it's oddly comforting. The Renaissance, with all its scandal, didn't end civilization. It made it bearable. It accepted that humans want to be good and adored simultaneously. That love, ego, faith, and art are messy, and always will be. All the marble, all the hymns, all the corruption. It wasn't hypocrisy. It was humanity getting creative about its cravings. Rome simply had the best lighting for it. By the 17th century, the last great Renaissance heirs, those art families, those restless poets faded quietly. Their villas turned into museums. Their lineages merged into younger noble houses who pretended not to remember how their fortunes were made. But their taste in sensation survived. The soft lighting, the operatic gilt, the pleasure in polished words. The human soul learned refinement through its own embarrassment. So if you ever find yourself under Rome's night sky, try to imagine it as it was then. The streets slick with wine after a feast, the glow from open palace windows, the faint echo of lute strings, mixing with cathedral bells. Somewhere, a painter sketches his confessor's apprentice, and a cardinal promises reform tomorrow. Everyone wants to be forgiven. No one really wants to stop. That was the spirit of Renaissance. Rome not depravity for its own sake, but curiosity about how close you could stand to sin without setting your soul on fire. And as the fog of centuries rolls in, that restless, sensual heartbeat still murmurs beneath the stones. Every sermon still chases beauty. Every artwork still carries a whisper of defiance. We may preach restraint, but our history proves otherwise. We are creatures of appetite, endlessly redecorating our cage. The Renaissance didn't cure or corrupt humanity. It simply revealed the contradiction we'd always been. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine the faint sound of distant bells over cobblestone streets. Picture those saints looking down from painted ceilings, their gazes soft, knowing a little too human. They were sculpted by sinners who believed beauty might save them, who dared to decorate guilt instead of hiding it. And maybe that's why we still find them beautiful, because they look like us, just illuminated better.